Hey, friends, welcome back to another episode of the Evolving Man podcast. This episode is about COVID hysteria, and I'm talking with Mark Groves from Create the Love. It's a very personal conversation that Mark and I had sitting down together in person and talking about what it was like to go through the pandemic and watch what was happening in the public sphere, watch our government make decisions, watch our health authority promote certain things, and then see the contradictions and see the suppression of discourse and conversation about what was right, and watch the loss of freedom occur in the name of safety and morality. For me, as for most of you, this was a difficult time trying to figure out whether to speak out or not, what opinion a person could share without getting canceled. In fact, most of what Mark and I are going to talk about on this episode would have got us canceled off of YouTube a couple years ago. So, yeah, this is really interesting to put out there. And for me, I was really conflicted about whether to speak about this stuff a year and a half ago, because is this what my channel is about? Is this what I stand for? Is this kind of conversation really what my personal business is about, which is really like brotherhood, men's work, relationship work, personal evolution? Or is it just a side opinion, a political opinion? And is bringing that in going to cause me to lose my impact in the sphere that I want to be impactful in? Am I going to be going to be restricted from reaching more people to talk about personal growth, men's work, relationship work, personal evolution by sharing my opinions about the stuff that's happening in society and whether I think this is right or wrong, or what my opinion on a vaccine is, or what my opinion is on the suppression of speech in public? That was a difficult thing to wrestle with. And so we go through some of that with Mark. And Mark, in my opinion, was more courageous than I throughout all of this. He spoke out more clearly and more strongly than I. And in the end, honestly, I'm not sure whether I made the best decision. The jury is still out on that for me. I don't know what the right thing to do was. It's such a big question for me. I'm still wrestling with it. But what I can tell you is that I respect how Mark was showing up. And I did feel like there was a vacuum, a lack of people actually speaking their opinion into the public sphere at a crucial time. And part of that had a lot to do with the suppression of certain opinions. So we have one of those conversations here. If you're interested in hearing the perspective of someone who is, call it anti-establishment, as it relates to COVID and the decisions that were made on a larger level at that time in North America, particularly in Canada. If you're interested in that, you might enjoy this conversation if you want to hear a different perspective. And if you are more like myself and Mark, you might feel some validation in hearing us speak pretty candidly about what it was like for us and what we were seeing as things went on during the pandemic. So we talk about a lot of things. We talk about Mark's former career as a drug rep and how he saw that language permeating the news and the public sphere. And we talk about the weaponization of belonging to influence people's decisions and proposed solutions to how do we do this better next time. So thank you for watching. As always, thank you for subscribing. Thank you for hitting the notification bell so that you get notified when new episodes come out. And as always, keep doing your work. And thanks for listening. All right. Enjoy. Mark Groves. I think there were some good insights there on parenthood. Just a bit that I wanted to cover with you, because I saw during the pandemic, I saw you speaking out. I saw you speaking out in a strong way, and you were pissed about what you were seeing, and you were saying things that get people canceled.
Yeah, I definitely was. There's a lot of like DMs. I got a lot of DMs.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't take this jab. Maybe lockdowns aren't the solution. Maybe masks don't work. And I've never said this on my show, but I agreed with most of what you said. I was thinking along the same lines as you. And I was one of those people who was afraid to speak publicly the way that you were. So to start things off, I just want to say thank you for having the courage to do that. I know it's not easy. I know you received a lot of hate. And there was like one time where I posted an IG story about the trucker protest. And I was like, look at this, everybody. This is great. This looks like a peaceful protest to me.
Oh.
And I had people coming at me for being a racist, because this was clearly to them a racist
if you're the
protest.
government and there are people rising up against your draconian rules, what are you going to want to do? You're going to want to quell it. What's the fastest way to quell something today?
It's kind of
Call
classic.
a racist.
Yeah.
There was, I believe, one documented swastika and Confederate flag in Ottawa. That person was told to leave. It's a controversial moment in the convoy, but what I thought was really ironic is the Liberal Party just gave a standing ovation to a former Nazi.
That's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Oops.
And they're like, hey, but we're not Nazis. Sure, everyone can logically make that correlation. But when one person has a flag, or two, let's say, out of hundreds of, like
20,000 people or 30,000 people.
In a full day, I believe there was over 100,000
Yeah.
at one point. That didn't make everyone that thing.
Yeah.
But
Interesting,
that's
though,
what we do, right?
that a Nazi ended up in the House of Commons
Right.
a year later or a year and a half later.
I think we should just be able to hold all of these diverse perspectives. Like, the way that I oriented to the world didn't change. It's just what was accepted about orienting to challenges, or let's say, I'm just using like a mainstream narrative.
Right.
That changed. So the cultural norms have shifted now. We don't allow curiosity or questioning of what are held as altruistic and virtuous perspectives.
Yeah, right. It
Right.
became this, everything became a safety issue all of a sudden, right?
Well, it's brilliant. It's brilliant to frame it as a safety issue, because then if you don't say yes to it, then it means you're unsafe.
You're dangerous.
Exactly. And that language of harm, danger, has been used about the criticism of gender, about the criticism
Right.
of, sorry, not gender, but the criticism of the gender conversation,
Mm-hmm.
the criticism of climate conversation. The same strategy is being used, and I would argue that people are getting actually tired of the psychological manipulation that has been happening by using morality.
I hope so.
I sense it. I mean,
hope so.
the reason I spoke out, which I was very much like you, I think, at the beginning, we talked about this a bit offline, but I was scared of getting COVID. I was scared of dying. I was scared of all those things. I had my good friend who's a physician in New York on the podcast talking about how do you maintain health in a flu season, and not saying that it's a flu, but like he was very serious about COVID. And so my intention was always just to inform people.
Mm-hmm. I was this way too early on. Maybe we can move through this chronologically too. Like 2020, I was watching the news, and I was watching clips of China, and then I was watching things about Italy. And I remember the last men's group I sat in person, I shared with the group, I'm really feeling scared right now about this thing that's coming. And I think it's going to fuck us up. And I'm scared that I'm going to get sick and die. And the guy running the group said, sometimes when your life's going really well, you start to look for the problem that's around the corner. That could be what's happening for you. And I was like, okay, it's an interesting insight, but like, I think this is actually coming.
I love how he's like, you're just trying to escape your success and happiness.
And then 2 weeks later, it was like total lockdown. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was scared. I was freaking out on my roommate because he was running breath circles. Sorry, Steve.
Big breath.
I didn't
Yeah,
do- I
lots
didn't-
of breathing during COVID, buddy.
I didn't deal with that super well, but you did need to stop running breath circles at that time. But there was a lot of anxiety, and I was
Yeah, there
afraid
was.
COVID was going to come get us. And when it was 2 weeks to slow the curve, I was like, hey, this makes sense. And then,
I thought the same thing. Here, I will say about lockdowns is I did, once they were initiated, I was like, okay. And then I started to read the data on them because I'm like, oh, do lockdowns actually work? But then when you actually start to read about them, respiratory viruses that are aerosolized, I mean, lockdowns don't work. And the data has never supported lockdowns. So I thought that was kind of weird that they were, it wasn't that I was like, oh, no one locked down and no one protect each other. I was like, there's something, it doesn't make sense.
yeah.
And then when they use the PCR test to check for COVID, I used to sell a drug. So I was a pharmaceutical rep for 14 years. So I've launched drugs, I've taken them off the market. When you launch a drug, or when you sell a drug, you're given an objection handler. An objection handler is essentially a list of the most common objections you get for your drug, and then the most common ways to handle that.
Yep.
Here's a clinical trial, here's the sentence you say, you practice them with another rep in role play. And what I noticed was when the vaccine came out, they were like, it stops transmission.
Yeah, this is like a year in, right? January 2020 is when COVID's just about to hit North America. It's hitting Italy.
Yeah.
And then the end of 2020 is when they're starting to roll out the vaccine in the U.S., I believe. Like November, I think, was the election. And people were starting to get the jab then. So we're talking about a year in.
Yeah. And
They start rolling out the vaccine, and they're like, it stops transmission. It's going to prevent future variants. It's going to reduce death. And there was one other claim.
it's going to prevent hospitalization and death. It's going to reduce transmission.
Yeah.
What was another claim they had?
Uh,
You won't get COVID and you won't give it.
yeah, that's right.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so if you look at the the line of as this is happening, I am not a conspiracy theorist and I'm not even a skeptic. I'm just reading clinical data. I've been trained to read clinical trials and criticize them. So that's all I was doing. So I was reading the clinical trial that got the approval, the emergency use authorization.
Mhm.
And I was like, wait, they didn't even check to see if it reduces transmission. So it wasn't an actual endpoint of the trial.
They didn't even check.
And the argument
Yeah.
is that it wasn't powered to do that, which means it didn't have enough people. So I was like, okay, but either way, when you sell a drug, you can't sell a drug for something that it doesn't have an indication for, which is the legal approval for what it has evidence to say it can do.
Yeah.
So if I sell you a blood pressure drug and I say this drops blood pressure, systolic and diastolic by this amount, it's because I got approval.
Yeah.
I can't then say this treats congenital heart failure if it doesn't have studies and approval in that area.
Yeah.
So when they said it reduces transmission, I was like, where's the data? That doesn't make any sense that they can make that claim. And it's not even the pharma company that's making the claim now. It's the media and it's the government, which I'm like, wow, what's going on?
There was parroting of this sort of narrative all the way around, which started
Right.
to me became more and more suspicious. And I found that voices that were counter to that were just being eliminated.
Well, that was what was fascinating is I noticed that the response to my curiosity, which I never changed how I oriented to anything, as is how I orient to relationships, to anything. What happened was the media and public health were starting to frame that anyone questioning the efficacy was dangerous. And anyone, Matthias Desmet, who has now, his book has come out on the rise of totalitarian states. He talks about how when there's a large circulating anxiety,
Yeah.
that he calls it mass formation.
It's mass
Right.
formation psychosis.
Right.
Yeah.
So the mass then says, here's this source of anxiety, and they're presented with a solution to solve
They
the
will
anxiety,
take that.
which is the vaccine.
Yeah.
And then what happens is anybody who threatens the solution to heal and solve the anxiety is attacked.
Mm-hmm.
So you saw this really. See, this is what's fascinating, is if you can separate yourself from your choice, because I think a lot of the times when people have gotten vaccinated, or not, but especially vaccinated, they can't actually consider that they might have been bamboozled.
Right.
Because that actually then causes a massive amount of dissonance, because then we go, wait, that means I actually can't trust public health,
Mm-hmm.
but I can't trust my government.
Mm-hmm. And I
think for
put something
Canadians
in my body.
that I can't unput in.
Yeah.
Right. And if you actually look at how people were misled, they were misled about transmission. That's a fact.
Yep.
And people will go, well, that is only once Delta, once there was a variant, which, first off, it wasn't a pandemic of the unvaccinated. And the unvaccinated one theory is that the unvaccinated created the container for a variant
How convenient.
to mutate. But what's really fascinating is, one is, if I remember correctly, Omicron is actually not a direct descendant of Delta, which is fascinating, but that's a whole other can of worms. But the other argument is that it's actually through vaccinating a ton of people that you created a lot of pressure on the virus to then learn how to evade the vaccine,
Yeah.
which is exactly what Delta was.
Because you're not supposed to vaccinate into a pandemic, because it
Right.
forces an evolution.
Now, all these things, again, neither of us are doctors. Neither of us are claiming to be PhDs in this. But all of these things that you and I are talking about, when I was a rep, if there was a disagreement amongst physicians or medical experts, researchers, there was often debates in academic spaces.
Mm-hmm.
There was debates. But I understand that they didn't want to facilitate debates, because debates would cause people not to take the vaccine.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, the other thing that people were duped about was herd immunity. We get to 70%, we get to 80%,
Yes.
we get to 90%.
I believed in that. And then, you had Zach Bush on your show. I had Zach Bush on my show. And what he said on my show, if people go back and listen to the episode, he said coronaviruses take 2 years to circulate through the
Said it on
population.
mine too.
It's gonna be 2 years, folks. And then it's gonna become relatively inert. It'll be still around, but it'll be like the flu. Guess what happened at the 2-year mark? Omicron,
Right,
2022,
right.
January.
Yeah, the PCR test is fascinating. For those people, see, this is why when you started to build, if you weren't so captured by the fear and you had maybe one bit of questioning, because I don't actually think it's anyone's fault. I don't blame anybody for falling for, and I don't say falling for, that's probably the wrong term, because that infers shame, for being duped by the largest industrial strength marketing propaganda campaign in human history, collectively, a global one.
Yeah.
Because if you look at it, the messaging was pretty similar globally. It was
Yeah.
kind of, and there was also, if you look it up, it's called the Trusted News Initiative. There's a
Yes.
bunch of news stations that decided to sign up and say they were only going to be pro. Here's all the messages. There, CBC, I believe, Global.
And they agreed.
BBC, CNN.
They agreed in the Trusted News Initiative what misinformation is, and what
Right.
they were going to go after and try to cut out of all tech platforms. They were going to police tech as well.
Right, and they did. And so the PCR test, when I sold a drug that used the PCR test in part of its clinical application, I learned about the PCR test. So when the PCR test was being used to figure out if people had COVID, I was like, wait, you can't use PCR for diagnostic purposes. That doesn't make any sense. And they have what's called a cycle threshold. And so basically what a cycle threshold is, and if you look at the language, it was a CT. The higher your cycle threshold is, basically, this is so layman's terms, but it'll make it easy to understand. It magnifies the sample.
Right.
So the more you magnify it, the more likely you are to see whatever you desire.
Right.
So there's a recording of Anthony Fauci talking about, I believe it's anything above 35 cycle threshold is just dead nucleotides.
Right.
So, and the guy who created the PCR test says, if you turn it up enough, you'll find anything you want.
Yeah.
Kelly, I forget it, or Carrie something. Anyways, I say all this because when I started to find out the CT thresholds of the labs, they were almost always above 35.
Mm-hmm.
They were often 38, and some of them were they were above 40.
Mm-hmm.
So that means if you didn't have any symptoms and you were testing positive, you likely didn't actually have COVID.
You just
which
had
is really
some
fascinating.
dust in your nose that had dead COVID.
Right.
on
And
it.
yeah, it's also in here, not in the lungs. Anyways, all these are like little details to just say the way they actually confirmed people had COVID wasn't even 100% legit. If they had turned the cycle threshold down to 25 or something, then yeah, okay,
Yeah.
combine symptomatic with that, sure. But what they did by saying that you can not know you have it and give it to people. We've never thought that about a flu, ever.
Yeah.
So now what happens is unconsciously, you and I believe that healthy people are biological threats.
Yeah.
Well, that's brilliant.
That'll make
Because that turned us all against each other.
Yes, that'll make you anxious. There's a lot of fear.
People were terrified in Vancouver, I remember.
Yep.
Hiking trails, wearing masks, walking 6 feet apart.
Oh, yeah.
6 feet apart was a random number too.
Some lady
Made no sense.
in the grocery store, I came up behind her and she was like, 6 feet, 6 feet. Like she turned around and like made me step back.
Dude,
You know?
I went like 4 feet the wrong direction of the arrows that saved all our lives in the grocery store.
Yeah.
And I went the wrong direction to just grab something.
Yeah.
The guy was like, "You're going the wrong way." And I was like, "I am. And I'm grabbing the right. And I will see you later."
Yeah, this piece around the testing is like, I know Donald Trump said, you know, if you don't test for it, you can't see it, and then you're not so anxious about it.
Well,
And that's
brilliant.
that's going really far with it, but like he was making this sort of opposite point from we've got to test everybody all the time so that we can see where COVID is, because that creates a fear and an anxiety that just makes everybody do what you want them to do. But like, if you've just dealt with people who show up with bad symptoms and treat that and focus on that more than you focus on trying to stop this thing that you can't stop and trying to catch it in the air and just isolate everybody, like it created a hysteria.
Agreed.
And then most people got on board with that. And if you weren't on board with that, you were canceled. You were ousted from your family. Like, I know dozens of people whose families,
So many.
including my own, actually, they had the biggest conflicts they've had in a decade. And some of those are still ongoing.
I know people who don't talk to siblings, who didn't get invited to Thanksgiving or Christmas. See, this is when things become emotional, they lose rationality. We know this from a relational perspective, that I could show you all the data in the world, but if you are emotionally attached to an ideology, which COVID became an ideology, masks have become an ideology. You know, you look at the Cochrane Review, which is considered the most credible review in science and literature, and they were like, masks actually don't do anything.
Yeah, they covered 35 studies. They did like a meta-analysis of masks.
Yeah, and you could present that to anybody. And sure, people could wear an N95. Great. You know, I don't care what people want to do. It's just, I'm not going to leave reality to entertain someone's psychosis, which what I think COVID did is it really exploited people who already have anxiety, who already have cleanliness, concerns,
Yeah.
who are OCD, and I get it. That's why I don't blame people, because at the end of the day, I never cared if people got vaccinated. They could if they wanted to. I actually didn't know the vaccine status of the people around me because I knew that if they got it, they should be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And because I'd already had COVID at that point, I was like, I'm not going to go get something now that can ruin my natural immunity, which is far more robust.
Mm-hmm.
There's another massive red flag.
Yeah.
When they started to say that vaccinated immunity was better than natural immunity. This is the arrogance of man and humans, is that we think that we can create something that's smarter than nature.
Yeah.
I mean, all of this is just, it points to me to how many systems are actually corrupt. I never bothered to investigate vaccines prior to this.
Mhm.
I never actually probably would have questioned them. I didn't even question this one. I was curious about the mRNA vaccine because I was like, okay, let me look up the history of these. Here's where I want to come back to the objection handler. Here's what I noticed was happening to people is they were sounding exactly like trained pharmaceutical reps.
Right, drug reps.
So if I was like, someone said, hey, are you getting the vaccine? And I'm like, nah, I'm going to wait. There's no long-term data. They would say, actually, you know what? They've been around forever. They were originally discovered in this time, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, wait, what? It's exactly what a rep would have said to me if I was a physician.
Yeah.
And so,
Well, they were telling people to go talk to your family.
right.
Go talk to your kids. Go talk to your parents. Like there was,
Have you seen that video of Trudeau when he says,
yeah.
parents, leave the room for a second. I want to talk to your kids.
Yes.
I mean, if you had said in 2019 that any of this stuff would have happened, a regular person would have said we're crazy. And that actually is what's so interesting about all of this is I didn't care what you got. I just care how they treated people
Yeah.
who wanted to be discerning about what they put in their bodies. That is my whole problem is the
Yeah.
exploitation of psychology and the weaponization of belonging. That's my big issue.
Yeah.
Everything, if you want to get 12 boosters, get an IV that is just wear it for the rest of your life. That is
Pure
just
mRNA.
pure mRNA.
Yeah.
I don't care. That's your choice. I don't recommend it, but I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
I care that people I love are continuing to get them because the evidence is just, I don't understand how you can objectively look at the evidence and be like, that's for you if you're healthy and under a certain age and don't have a bunch of comorbidities. But I'm not here to give recommendations. I'm not a doctor. Consult some doctors. But I'm like, the way that we made each other treat one another.
Yeah. And the line that was drawn where you can't come into this restaurant, you can't get on this plane, you can't cross this border unless you get this jab, put this mask on, get this passport. That's the line that was not okay with me.
It's not.
Right?
I agree.
Like do what you want with your own life. Protect yourself if you want to protect yourself, however you see fit. But locking a whole sector of people out of society because they're not getting on board with what you're doing, that's way out there. You know, and like
it's way out there.
If we're normalizing that, like that makes me scared for what's next. So we could probably talk about this forever, but the main thing I want to ask is, you know, now that this is quote over, I mean, it's over for us. It was over for us a long time ago. What lessons have you learned from this? What do you want to say to people about what humanity has learned from this process? Like, how do we not do this again to each other? Big questions.
Well, let's start with the first part of like, if we were actually bringing critical thinking into any of those moments, we all knew that it didn't stop transmission and that there were breakthrough infections. So we knew that by December 2021 for sure. We actually, technically, they knew that in January 2021. Rachel Walensky, who's the head of the CDC, was.
Right.
She knew that in
knew.
January 2021.
Yeah, she was on TV saying that it stops transmission, but it's
She had
now been
received an
revealed
email.
that
Yeah.
she knows.
So
She
you
knew.
have that.
Mhm.
You have that the White House, and I would argue for sure Canada too, but really the U.S. was doing everything, censored truthful information that may cause vaccine hesitancy. That is a fact,
Mhm.
and that was revealed by Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi from the Twitter files.
That's right. And they also like deleted all kinds of accounts that were challenging the narrative, including Alex Berenson.
Who now is
They emailed Twitter to ask for Alex Berenson to be canceled, like cancel his account. They did. Then he recently sued Twitter and won and got his account back, and now he's suing the president and the government.
Yeah, and like most people don't have a clue that any of this happened, by the way. Like most people don't know that Meta censored truthful information that may cause vaccine hesitancy. Well, my argument is if it may cause vaccine hesitancy and it's true, you probably deserve to know it.
Yeah.
So you've got a knowing that it doesn't stop transmission, but then you have the input of passports and mandates.
Mm-hmm.
In September of 2021, October 2021. So, and also Trudeau, if you're Canadian at that time, completely pivoted. He changed his whole rhetoric. You will not get on a train, a plane, or a bus beside a vaccinated person if you're unvaccinated. Life's going to be hard for you.
Yeah.
Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand saying, yeah, it's going to be hard. If you want truthful information, the truth only comes from us.
It only comes from us, she said. I watched a video clip of that just the other day. She said, if you're not hearing it from us, it's probably not the truth.
And I say all this because everything I'm saying is true. You can go fact check it. I'm true. This is all facts. Mm-hmm. So you have all of these things happening, and then in October you have Thanksgiving in Canada, and you've got December, obviously, everywhere people have Christmas. And you have the news saying, people like Rachel Gilmore, saying, do not invite your unvaxxed uncle.
Right.
And in a video she says, and she's like basically a TikTok-y. She got fired by Global, but she used to work for them, and she's, I would say, caused a lot of division just herself. She wonders why she's disliked, but it's pretty obvious why she's disliked. And she said, yes, there are breakthrough infections, but they're rare, and the vaccine still works super good. You're not allowed to promote something and not give. The amount of things that we've let go, and the amount of people who use things like shame. You shouldn't invite your uncle. So now your uncle. So I have a friend, actually, which gives the example of the uncle. She was going to go to her family's Christmas. Her family said, you can't come, you're unvaccinated. December 2021.
Right.
She said, but the vaccine doesn't stop transmission. They said, listen, it's for our comfort. These are the boundaries we have.
Uh-huh.
And she said, but wouldn't it be smarter if all of us got tested? Because then if all of us got tested, you could still give it to me and I could still give it to you. But if all of us get tested, like you being vaccinated actually doesn't matter.
Right.
That's rational. That's critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
They were like, no, because it had been moralized.
Yes.
So here's this family that said, our daughter can't come to the first Christmas she's ever not been welcome at. Mm-hmm. And she's in her 30s. Because she didn't choose to get something that public health and the government said, you're less of a person and you're more selfish. Mm-hmm. In Brene Brown's work, she talks about how dehumanization always begins with language. As humans, we have a circle, basically, of people that we see as people like us, and we're not willing to harm anyone in our circle. But the moment we create, or there is something that we say, they're now outside the circle, and that begins with language. They're dirty. Mm-hmm. They're a threat. Mm-hmm. They're selfish.
Dangerous.
They're right-wing. They're this. They now go outside the circle, and now we can harm them. So passports and mandates were not rational, because if it was about the reduction of transmission, they didn't actually do anything. They were, and Bonnie Henry's acknowledged this, they were to incentivize getting more people vaccinated.
Yes, it was an incentive.
And there's a lot of people, and if you're listening and you're someone who went, if you wouldn't have gotten it unless you needed to travel or work,
would you have gotten it?
Yeah, and if the answer is no, or maybe no, if you're willing to acknowledge it, then you were manipulated.
Yep. 30 to 40% of my friends fall into that category. So many of the people that I talk to were like, initially were saying, nah, I don't think so. I'm hesitant. And then they ran into a wall. They needed to travel. Mom or dad was sick. They needed to get home. They needed to get a job. Their job threatened to fire them. They signed up for school. There's all they wanted to run a retreat, and the hotel that they were running the retreat at required it.
They needed to keep their job.
They needed to keep their job.
Yeah, and that's why it's not anyone's fault. Because who said yes under those pretenses? No. I mean, if you wanted to go to Cancun and you got it, you got to decide where you're in, But these are the choices we have to make in our life. And I why I don't blame people is that's actually a violation of informed consent. Now,
It is,
ethics of a mandate outside of whether it stopped transmission or not are a whole other conversation. I don't agree with them in general anyways, but if we were under the premise that if it stopped transmission, then a mandate would make sense or a passport would make sense, then you're in a real slippery slope. And
Yep.
I think psychologically in Canada now and other places that have passports, here's the thing that I think everyone needs to know. If you voted yes to mandates and passports and they have come into Canada, they've since left, but they could come back anytime, right? They could make that choice because it wasn't because the population said no, although they tried. It's because the flight mandate was being challenged in court, so they got rid of the flight mandate right before the court hearing so that the government could dismiss the hearing under mootness. That it was a moot point now because it wasn't relevant.
Interesting.
And so they did actually get that, but it's being appealed, and the hearing is actually on October 12th, I believe, for the appeal. But here's the thing unconsciously and subconsciously that has occurred now to everybody in Canada, whether you're for mandates or not, is that when they froze people's bank accounts who donated for what at the time was a legal protest, when people donated to that, it was not considered a quote-unquote illegal blockade. Right? So even if you were for it, now you live in a world, in a country, that if the government or the majority decides that your opinion is not okay and your perspective is not okay, you can be financially frozen and you can be mandated to do something. It might have worked in your favor today, but in the future, they might come for you.
Yeah, based on whatever choice feels right to you
at that time. And you might be the one in the other group. And so you have now unconsciously agreed to create a society and a culture and a country that actually is not psychologically safe. At the ether of mosquito out. At the ether of our culture now, it is not psychologically safe to express yourself. Because the cost isn't just you might get canceled. Your bank account might get frozen. And the government might consider you an other.
And then the government may also convince your family to reject you and kick you out of the family, essentially. Right?
And when people compare this to World War II, I understand that the response to that is it minimizes the atrocity that Jews experienced. But we study history so we don't repeat it.
And you're talking about a slope, right?
Right.
What I hear you saying is like, hey, we slid and we're on the slide. And the next thing that happens could just take us much further down that road. And there was a slow slide that occurred in Germany after the First World War, where you had a depression and you had a group, an entire country that was anxious, that was dealing with poverty, and that was looking for an enemy. And then you had someone come along who was like, I know who the enemy is. It's those people.
Right.
And there's a cleanliness issue here. There's a hoarding issue. There was all of this finger pointing and this slow convincing of like, hey, this is the enemy here. And we need to start turning these people into second-class citizens. And it went really far. It went as far as it goes. And so I hear you on that comparison. So yeah, just to come back to it is like,
that was a long answer to your
lessons
question.
learned.
What's the lesson learned?
What do we do? What do you want the people listening to this to do next time there's this kind of opportunity for the powers that be to push through an agenda and create divisiveness in the culture? Like, what do we need to do? Like, how can we do this differently?
I mean, for me, the greatest thing I learned in the last 3 years was that what I'm willing to stand for, and that when push comes to shove, like, I'm willing to lose everything to stand in what is integrity for me. I think for all of us, we might not have all stood up to the previous wave of gaslighting and manipulation, but we have a chance now. And that begins, healing begins with the acceptance of reality. There is no change that occurs without accepting where we have been and who we have been.
Mm-hmm.
We have to accept what's happened. Like, we dehumanized a group of people. We manipulated everybody in society. We violated informed consent. Governments misled people on the benefits of a product. And that's why the level of deception has so many layers now that to say we actually messed up and maybe we shouldn't have pushed this on pregnant women and young men,
Yeah.
and wait, myocarditis is a thing. And,
Yeah.
oh, maybe it's not transient. I mean, there's just been so much that it's hard for us to hold the capacity of the dissonance of what it means to be deceived and that we were deceived. And I think for me, one thing I've learned too is that I was not good at holding difference, and I was not good at loving people who saw things differently. I love people who chose something different. But now I'm like, I always come back to this quote that I heard Jonathan Haidt say. And he wrote the book Coddling of the American Mind with Greg Lukianoff.
Right.
One of the best books I've read in the last 5 years. Everyone should read it because it tells you everything about the cultural circumstances that are happening today, because this isn't just about COVID and just about vaccines. This is about how we orient to difference and how what's going on culturally now, what cancel culture was a sign of. And, you can have accountability without annihilation.
Right.
But we've annihilated people, and in the wake of that, people are terrified to share how they feel. I hear parents who are terrified to share. And there's a school in Ontario, or a public library, that removed all books from I believe it was 2008. Just all books.
Wow.
Because of the potential offensive nature of some of those books. And I went, this is what happens when you don't stand up.
Yeah.
Dumb ideas proliferate. And so, because you're being afraid of being called a name at a parent council meeting, like, grow up.
Yeah. Speak up.
It's time. Because if you don't share how you actually feel, by not speaking up, you are actually colluding with and consenting to a culture that doesn't value discourse.
Yes.
And the reason I get activated and excited about this is because it's so important. I'm watching the conversations about climate follow the same specific mechanism. You're a climate denier. You criticize this vaccine, the mRNA. You could have had every shot prior to today. You're anti-vax.
You're anti-vax,
You
even if you have all the
criticize
shots.
any of those,
Yep.
you're right wing. We live in BC. You couldn't find a right wing if you tried.
Yeah.
But now what I notice about the left, which I use that in quotes, is that it now doesn't believe its own shit stinks. It doesn't believe in discourse, and it's become a captured ideology. And when people talk about wokeism, which I don't like using words like woke or wokeism because they, again, create more binaries. But that perspective that we're going to do everything we want to do, and it's going to be dressed up in virtuosity.
Yeah.
So these are
It's all pure. There's like this Puritan
It is
thing
very
going
much
on.
the purity movement that was unleashed upon Christians, 10 years ago, that created a lot of depressed, anxious, upset Christians, and so for me, I think the lesson is we have to learn to find our voice again.
Yeah, right.
And we got to learn to actually hear each other. And we got to learn about discourse. And that quote from Jonathan Haidt is, when there's two opinions, people are made seemingly wiser by hearing both of them.
Right.
Because there's a third truth that is made present or
between the
made
two.
aware by the alchemy of the two.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's such a beautiful truth that you and I, if we don't discourse, we actually become more dumb.
Yeah. You end up in an echo chamber. That's part of the problem, right?
It is, man.
So we need to
So-
learn to speak up, speak our truth, even if it's inconvenient. And what I'm also hearing in what you're saying is it's very important to fight for the freedom to disagree, fight for the freedom to have a different opinion, and fight for the freedom of others and for ourselves to be able to make our own choices. Right?
Amen. You know, Elon Musk says that the sign of healthy free speech is that someone you don't like can say something you don't like.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, it is not easy to hear speech that we consider hate, obviously. But like, who gets to decide? Because information that was truthful about a product that you were being told you had to take was censored because someone decided that speech wasn't okay.
Yeah. We are better off with all of the ideas being present in the town square versus having gatekeepers allow what's allowed in the town square. That's why I downloaded Twitter
Beautiful.
when Elon bought it.
I
Because
totally agree.
I never had Twitter.
Oh, you didn't?
No, but when I heard he bought it, I was like, wow, this is going to be interesting. I'd like to see what's there now, you know, and I've enjoyed it. There's a lot of things on there that I don't like, and it shows me things that I don't want to see sometimes. But I would rather place be free and open than this sort of sculpted reality. I don't want to be locked in the matrix. I want the bigger picture, and we have to fight for that to be the case. So
Yeah, and you know, when I consider all of the things that have occurred in the last 3 years, I think what it's done is it's allowed. First, I'll say that if you found a split or a rupture between you and another person because of their political view or because of their vaccine view or COVID view, get them back. Like, to me, I can't believe that people are not talking to someone because they vote for someone.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is how
Mm-hmm.
fragile we are today. And, you know, romantic relationships, interpersonal relationships, families, communities, cultures, democracies, countries, the world are made healthier by being able to handle difference. There is not a single human system in the world that is not made better by diversity. Not just diverse type of people, but diverse type of thought.
Yes.
And that is a fact. And when you look at really healthy couples, it's how they hold difference. They hold it with reverence. The space between you and I as friends is sacred. And that doesn't make it loses its reverence the moment I say what you're saying is less than or less valuable than what I'm saying. And so I think we have a lot of opportunity to learn how fragile we are and how little we can actually allow our identities and our beliefs and our ideologies to be flexible and influenced. Another piece of data about successful couples is they're open to the influence of their partner.
It's
Look
a
at
Gottman.
you know?
Yeah. Gottman statistic.
So thanks for letting me clear that rant a bit. And it's been a journey, but man, I've found a deeper part of my voice.
Yeah.
Because I've realized, like, you can't take any of this from me now.
Yeah. Right. Like, there's been this external challenge to your values and your voice, right, through all of this. And it's been the same for me, you know.
Well, I acknowledge you because I started to see you speaking up, and also saying to people, like, I wanted to speak up earlier.
Yep.
And I think when we start to use our voice, like I'm encouraging people to do, it removes the social risk for others. Because ultimately the reason in a cancel culture or in a society or in a family or in a religion, the reason we don't actually speak up is because the social cost is perceivably too high.
That's right.
So the more of us that speak up, the less social risk it is perceptually for someone else. And so that's why we got to get loud. But that's also why algorithms turn down the volume on influential voices. But if you look now, who are the most powerful voices right now in the world? The most powerful media voice in the world is Joe Rogan, for sure.
Yeah, and Russell Brand.
Joe Rogan gets 143 million downloads a month. He's something like 40 times greater than CNN.
Tucker Carlson.
I mean,
Right.
You've got these people who you might not agree with what they stand for. Although anyone who calls Joe Rogan right-wing, I'm like, listen to one of his podcasts. He's definitely not right-wing.
You know, it does give me hope that I don't agree with everything Joe says or
Same.
Tucker or Russell, but the fact that these guys currently have a voice does give me hope,
Same.
because
Agreed.
they are counterculture in many respects, for better or worse. It's not always for better, but I I do believe in the counterculture.
Something ended.
I appreciate you coming on the show again. I appreciate you speaking the truth and for being loud. And you learn the quality of a person's character through things like this, And I saw your character through COVID, through the last few years. I see your character as a father and how you're showing up for Kai. And yeah, thank you, man, for all the work you do. And I've got your back.
Brother, thanks for having me, man. I'm so appreciative. And to all of you, thank you for trading time to listen to me. I really know that it's the one thing we can't get back in this dimension. So I'm super grateful. And brother, right back at you, man. Always deep reverence for you, for what you stand for, the values you have, the integrity you have, and witnessing you as a father playing with your daughter it brings me joy. So I'm excited to share this next part of our journey together.
Yeah, buddy. It's going to be fun.
Appreciate you.
Thanks, brother. Till next time.
Till next.
Bye. All right, that's it for this episode with Mark Groves. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope we didn't ruffle too many feathers. And before you decide to cancel me or Mark Groves for having this conversation, consider the fact that actually talking with us might be a better option. So drop a comment, engage with us online, like or dislike, subscribe or unsubscribe. But please engage with us, engage with other people, have conversations, and consider that the suppression of speech might not be a good thing for humanity. All right, folks, until next time, all the best to you.